She was 11, old enough to understand the weight of a whisper, but still too young to know that silence could be a sentence. It began with a dress, not one of hers, too fine, too stiff, the kind stitched for display, not comfort. The maid didn't meet her eyes while tying the laces, said nothing when the girl asked where they were going. Just tightened the bodice, smoothed the sleeves, and turned away. Outside, the carriage waited. She was told to smile when she stepped inside. She did. Because at 11 no one had ever taught her that smiling could be a lie. The ride was long, each turn of the wheels carrying her farther from the place she called home, though even that had been little more than polished cold floors and echoes that never answered back. She thought she was going to visit the court, a celebration, a formal education, a chance to grow into something important. What she didn't know was that the papers had already been signed, the arrangements made, the silence bought. She was being traded, not for gold, not for land, but for favour. Her father said it was a gift. Her mother wept, but only in private. And the maid who had braided her hair that morning left the room the moment the carriage turned the corner, because no one wanted to witness what came next. She arrived at dusk. The estate smelled like stone and smoke. The man who greeted her didn't kneel or smile. He studied her like she was parchment, thin, blank, and made to be written on. She curtsied. He nodded. And that was that. No ceremony, no blessing, no welcome. Just a corridor, a door, and a voice behind her saying, "You belong here now." That night she didn't sleep. The bed was large, but the air felt too close. The candles burned low, casting shadows that shifted like warnings. She clutched the pillow, not for comfort, but to have something that hadn't yet been taken. The silence was complete, not peaceful, not gentle. The kind of silence that presses against your ribs and asks you to be smaller, quieter, easier to ignore. She tried to pray, but the words caught in her throat, as if even God didn't want to hear them. In the morning, she was told to smile again, this time for a portrait. She stood still while the painter measured her angles. She didn't blink when the brush passed near her face, because even at 11 she understood that the only thing more dangerous than being noticed was being forgotten. So she made herself into something they wouldn't throw away, obedient, delicate, silent. But deep beneath that practiced stillness, something had already begun to stir. Not rage, not rebellion, something older, something colder. The first crack in the foundation of the girl they tried to mould, and if anyone had looked closely, if anyone had dared, they might have seen it. The storm wasn't coming. It was already here. It just hadn't learned to speak yet. But you're not supposed to hear these stories, not the ones with soft voices, not the ones that never made it into the royal records, not the girls they broke before the crown was even offered. So if you're still here, if you haven't looked away, then stay. Because what they did to her next was meant to be buried, and we're going to dig it up. Subscribe if you believe the silence of history needs to be broken, and keep watching, because her story is just getting started. He didn't look like a monster, that's what made it worse. He sat straight, wore velvet cuffs, spoke softly, with a kind of voice that makes you feel foolish for ever being afraid. And at the end of the table he smiled. She was placed across from him, a full table away. But his eyes reached her long before his hands ever did. Dinner was served on silver. There were pears soaked in honey, meat carved so delicately it seemed like an art. A flute played in the background. It was beautiful, and completely wrong, because no one made eye contact. The servants moved too quickly, and the girl sitting beside her kept tapping her own fingers, quiet, rhythmic, like a warning. He asked her questions, simple ones. Do you like music? Do you know how to read Latin? Have you ever danced with a nobleman? She answered politely, because she had been trained to. Because being agreeable was safer than being noticed for the wrong reasons. and every time she spoke he watched her mouth. Not her eyes, not her posture, just her mouth. She felt it before she understood it, that gaze that isn't admiration, but possession. She reached for her cup. It trembled in her hand. She smiled anyway. Across the table, the girl beside her whispered a number. 3. She looked over. The girl didn't explain. She didn't have to. 3 girls before her. 3 who sat in that seat. 3 who vanished when they stopped being new. The man continued speaking. He called her clever, said she had the mind of a woman twice her age. Everyone chuckled like it was charming, but she wasn't old enough yet to be flattered, only old enough to feel that something inside her was starting to cave in. After dinner, he approached, not with force, with compliments, said she reminded him of someone, asked if she liked poetry, promised to send her a book. His hand brushed her shoulder as he passed. It wasn't a touch meant to be noticed. It was meant to be allowed. That night, the door to her room stayed unlocked. Nothing happened, but that was the test. And she had failed it by being there, by not screaming, by existing in the wrong place at the wrong time in the body they decided was ready. She asked the maid to bolt the door the next night. The maid didn't answer, just looked at her with that same soft pity, the way someone might look at a bird in a cage that doesn't know the top is open. The cage wasn't meant to hold her. It was meant to teach her she had no wings. So she folded them, quietly. She stopped smiling, stopped asking questions, stopped thinking of home. She stopped everything but listening. And in the days that followed, she would come to understand something most people never have to learn, that a predator doesn't always roar. Sometimes he reads sonnets. Sometimes he kisses your hand in front of the court. Sometimes he feeds you pears with honey and calls you exceptional right before writing your name on a list of things he owns, and everyone else just keeps eating. They told her she was lucky. Lucky to be chosen. Lucky to dine with nobles. Lucky to wear silk while other girls scrubbed floors. But luck is just another kind of leash. It's how they keep you from biting. Each day, a new gift appeared in her chamber. A ribbon. A pendant. A book too advanced for an 11-year-old to read, but filled with romantic poetry just suggestive enough to make her skin crawl. The gifts didn't come with notes, but everyone knew where they came from. She was told to curtsy when he entered, to thank him when he complimented her gown, to smile when he offered his arm, and she did. Because saying no didn't feel like an option. It felt like a test. They trained her without rules. Every word was a lesson, every gaze an inspection. When she blushed, they called her charming. When she froze, they laughed and said she was shy. And when she asked to return home, "Home? But you belong here now." The servants weren't cruel. They were worse. They were kind. They braided her hair. They helped her dress. They whispered gentle lies to keep her calm. "You're being prepared. It's an honor. Every girl goes through this. Every girl." That's how they said it, like it was a rite of passage, like being moulded was the same as being loved. She learned to be still, still when he touched her wrist too long, still when his eyes lingered, still when he said things in passing that made her stomach twist. She started counting the number of steps between her room and the chapel, between the dining hall and the courtyard, between her safety and his voice. She wasn't allowed to run, but she could remember. She could make maps in her mind, escape routes, corners where she could hide, moments she could disappear if only for a breath. Because by now she knew. This wasn't training. It was grooming, and no one would stop it. Not the priest who turned his gaze away, not the tutor who changed the subject, not the noble women who smiled too politely when her name was mentioned. They all played the same game. Keep her obedient, keep her agreeable, keep her quiet long enough to forget what she was before all this began. But they miscalculated one thing. She wasn't forgetting. She was recording. Each comment, each glance, each soft word twisted into a command. She logged them in silence, stacked them like stones, not for revenge, not yet, for something deeper, something darker, a foundation. Because the girl they thought they were breaking was building herself beneath the wreckage, and someday, when the walls finally came down, she'd know exactly who helped build them and where each stone came from. They didn't announce it. There was no trial, no accusation, no ceremony, just a note handed to a steward. Just a whisper passed between guards. Just a silent order written in a hand she'd never see. At 12 years old, she was told she was being moved. For her safety, they said. To a quieter place where she could rest, recover, reflect. She was given one bag, one dress, no maid, and the carriage didn't stop until the road narrowed, and the trees thickened, and the sky looked more like ash than daylight. The estate was small, forgotten, no court, no visitors, just grey stone and thin curtains and a single guard who never spoke. They didn't call it a prison, but nothing was unlocked. The room had no ink, no books, no mirrors. The windows were too high to see out of. The door creaked every time it opened, once a day. Enough for a tray, enough to remind her that someone still remembered she was alive. But no one spoke to her. Not the steward who dropped off food, not the woman who cleaned without making eye contact, not the priest who visited once, looked at her too long, and never came back. She wasn't dangerous. She wasn't guilty. She was inconvenient. The whispers had started. Some said she was getting too clever. Others said she had seen too much. One man claimed she had cursed him with a single look, and instead of silencing the whispers, they silenced her. Weeks passed. Time lost meaning. The candle burned out faster each night. The walls felt closer. She stopped speaking aloud, not out of despair, but calculation. Because no one was listening anyway. Because sound was wasted here. And because silence, she realised, could be sharper than a scream. She traced the cracks in the wall like constellations, made stories out of the chipped floor tiles, imagined escape routes that didn't exist. But she never cried. Not once. Because if she did, she was afraid it would never stop. She knew this wasn't exile. It was a pause. They weren't finished with her, just reshaping her into something easier to control. A ghost, a shadow, a name people used without remembering the girl it belonged to. But they underestimated her again. Because while the world tried to forget her, she was remembering everything. Every face that turned away, every hand that guided her here, every polite lie dressed as concern. They wanted her to break in private so she wouldn't explode in public. But what they built instead was a girl who no longer needed permission to exist. And when the door finally opened again, when they called her back like a piece of furniture they missed, she didn't rush to greet them. She didn't smile. She stepped into the light slowly, as if the sun needed her approval. Because the girl they locked away wasn't the one who came back. The girl was gone. What returned was a silence sharpened into steel. They left a box by mistake, tucked behind the hearth in the corner of the room. A wooden crate marked for removal, never claimed. She opened it one morning, her fingers trembling not from excitement, but from the sheer strangeness of touching something that hadn't been chosen for her. Inside were books, dusty, unbound in places, smelling of ash and time. No fairy tales, no prayers, just volumes of history, philosophy, anatomy. One was written in Latin, another in French, one in a language she didn't even recognise, but she tried anyway. Because these weren't just pages. They were doorways no one could lock. She began to read in silence, the way others pray. Eyes scanning lines like footsteps through a garden no one else knew existed. The books didn't pity her. They didn't whisper warnings. They didn't ask her to smile. They made her feel like her thoughts were allowed to stretch. Like her mind didn't have to sit with folded hands and bowed head. In those pages she met queens who reigned without marriage, Philosophers who argued without fear, women who disguised themselves as men to enter rooms they weren't allowed in. She underlined sentences with a sliver of charcoal, marked the margins with symbols only she understood. A dagger meant betrayal, a flower meant freedom, a star meant something she needed to remember. She copied words into the wood of the bed frame, not names, those could be taken, ideas. Silence is not the absence of voice, it is the choice to withhold it. The strongest minds bend before they strike. Fear is loudest when it knows it is dying. They became her scripture, not because they promised salvation, but because they didn't ask her to wait for it. In a world that tried to erase her, she carved herself into the margins of forgotten books. No one came to test her. No one cared what she knew, but knowledge wasn't for them. It was for her. It was the first thing they hadn't given her and couldn't take away. She taught herself to speak differently, to write with authority, to smile with meaning instead of obedience. And when they finally returned for her, when the door opened again and the nobleman said her name like it still belonged to him, she stood taller than before. Because this time, she wasn't stepping into their world as a child. She was stepping in as something else. A girl full of names they didn't know, histories they had ignored, and words they would never be able to unhear once she learned how to speak them. When she returned to court, they barely recognized her. Same hair, same small frame, same eyes. Though no one looked too long into those anymore, because something had shifted, not in how she walked, but in how she watched. She had learned what they never meant for her to know, how to see people the way they saw her, not as humans, as patterns. He smiles too quickly, he lies when he touches his beard. He stares when he thinks no one's watching. He flinches when you speak Latin, because he can't. She didn't need power to be dangerous, she only needed to remember, and she remembered everything. The Lord who called her little dove in the halls but property in letters. The priest who said nothing while watching everything. The steward who once warned her to behave, then asked for her forgiveness with his eyes. She filed them away like numbers in a ledger. Not for revenge. Not yet. She studied how men gave orders, how they softened their cruelty with compliments, how they played games with each other's daughters like pieces on a board, always pretending it was about alliance, never appetite. They thought she was quiet now because she was obedient, but she was silent because she was listening. She remembered how the man at the end of the table once leaned too close, how he praised her silence, how he called her well-trained. She had been trained, but not the way he thought. She had learned when to look away, when to bow, when to give just enough of herself to stay safe. But now she was learning when not to. She practiced how to hold her gaze a second too long, how to make a question sound like a compliment, how to suggest without speaking, just like they did. She watched them try to read her and smiled when they failed, because no one suspects the girl who once cowered. No one questions the one who already bled. They think survivors are too broken to fight, but she had never stopped fighting. She'd just been waiting for them to stop watching, and now they had. Now they saw a quiet girl in pearls, a docile figure, perfectly shaped, someone they could use, again. But what they missed was the ledger she kept behind her eyes, a record of every insult, every theft, every man who ever looked at her and saw only potential. And when the time came, when the crown needed a mind it could trust, when the court crumbled under the weight of its own secrets, when the king's favour began to rot, they would turn to her. Because she looked harmless, because they never knew that the most dangerous weapon in the room was the girl they once tried to silence. They brought her back in spring. The court was blooming, the laughter louder, the games faster, and no one asked where she'd been, not out loud. The whispers slithered beneath every corridor. Wasn't she the one? I thought she'd been sent away. Why is she here again? She answered none of them, because she didn't need to, not anymore. They gave her a place in the second row, far enough from the king to be dismissed, close enough to be noticed. They wanted her to be grateful, to feel chosen again. But she didn't play the part anymore. She listened, watched, counted things others missed. Who stood when certain names were spoken? Who smiled when others flinched? Who bowed out of fear instead of loyalty? She memorized the cracks in every alliance. She didn't make bold moves, didn't fight in open air. That wasn't survival, that was suicide. Instead, she made herself essential. She corrected a nobleman's Latin just softly enough to impress the bishop. She handed a foreign dignitary the correct scroll when everyone else fumbled. She remembered things, birthdays, illnesses, rivalries. She made herself the girl they couldn't replace. And slowly, they stopped asking where she came from, because now they needed her. That was her first victory, not a title, not a crown, not revenge, just survival on her terms. One man tried to corner her, a lord who had once spoken sweetly to her in darker rooms. He smiled as he reached for her wrist the way he used to, but this time she didn't freeze. She looked him in the eye, tilted her head, and said one sentence, "You taught me well." He withdrew before she even finished the smile. She didn't need to name him. He knew, and now he knew she remembered. The others noticed. They called it poise. They called it elegance. But the truth was sharper. It was the elegance of someone who'd already died once and come back with a ledger. She was no longer the girl they locked away. She wasn't even a girl. She was the reminder, the evidence. Proof that what they did in silence could still grow into something loud, something permanent. She hadn't risen through favour. She had endured her way up, and no one knew how to fight someone who had survived everything they designed to erase her. She didn't need revenge. She didn't need their apologies. She only needed the space to breathe and the silence to let them wonder how far she was willing to go now that they'd taught her exactly how far they were willing to fall. And when her name began appearing in letters, when envoys began asking her opinion, when even the king glanced her way with caution, she smiled. Not because she had won, but because she finally realized she never needed to. She only needed to remain. They say she rose by charm, by grace, by timing. They say she played her cards right, but that's not what happened. She rose because she endured, because every hand that tried to shape her into silence ended up revealing its own weakness, because every man who thought she was just a girl, a pawn, a pet, a pliable smile, found himself outranked by someone he never even saw coming. She didn't take power, she became it, not by force, by presence, by knowing which words to say and when not to say them, by smiling with lips that once trembled and holding the gaze of kings who thought she should still look away. She built alliances quietly, with women the men dismissed, with servants who knew every secret, with clerics who owed her nothing but respect. She didn't need soldiers, she had memory, and memory never missed. And when she stood in the centre of the court, not as a girl to be handled, but as a woman to be consulted, no one dared ask how she'd gotten there, because they already knew. They just didn't want to remember. She never told them what happened in that locked room, never named the hands that touched her, never pointed to the ones who watched. But they remembered too, and the silence she kept was louder than any accusation. It made them nervous, because if she had survived that, if she had endured being traded, groomed, erased, what else could she survive? What else could she take? They called her Your Grace, but that wasn't what she wanted. She didn't want their titles. She wanted their discomfort. She wanted them to know that the girl they discarded had lived long enough to rewrite the story, that she'd walked through the fire, memorized its temperature, and learned how to carry it in her eyes without ever burning. She wasn't trying to destroy them. She didn't need to. She only had to exist, to keep breathing, to keep speaking, to keep standing where no one had planned for her to be. Because power isn't always taken. Sometimes it's survived. And in the echo of every decision she made, every treaty signed, every alliance built, every life spared, there was the ghost of the girl they thought they'd buried, still watching, still remembering, still here,